morning, everyone. Good morning. Come on, we got more energy than that this morning now. Come on. I know I got more energy than that. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, there we go. My name is Jamil Graham, and I'm the Director of Student Life and Activities here at Essex County College. And I want to welcome you all to this year's Essex County College Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, brought to you by the Africana Institute and Student Life and Activities. This year's theme is Rolling Us Back, Voting Rights Retrospective. To begin our program, we're going to open with a wonderful selection from Professor Allgood and our very own Essex County College Choir. So let's give them a huge welcome and round of applause. Khalfani spirits. Let's give it up again for our choir. All right. Now for our keynote speaker. Dr. Khalfani is a published author, an associate professor of sociology at Essex County College, as well as the director, Africana Institute, and the director, Center for Global Education and Experiences. He has been the host and executive director of the Pulse TV show for 10 years and has served as the chair of the Social Justice Council. He has been recognized for his community service work by the United States Congress, the California and New York State Senates, the New Jersey and New York State Assemblies, and several municipalities in the Northeast. Dr. Khalfani earned a PhD and a master's degree in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania, from which he also earned a graduate certificate in African Studies. While living in South Africa, he studied at the University of Pretoria. So let's give it up for our very own Essex County College leader and mentor, Dr. Akil Khalfani.
I appreciate the kind words and the partnership, because we wouldn't do this without student life and activity. And let's give up the ECC Jazz Choir. So right now we have the honor of having our president, Dr. Boachi, who's going to say a few brief words, because he is actually in cabinet meeting right now. So he came down out of cabinet to come to greet us. So Dr. Boachi, please, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. Good president.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Khalfani, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And thank you for showing up this morning. It's always great when we gather together and think about the past, looking at our present, and also the future. Every time we talk about the past, I will remember the great things that have happened, especially through great men like Dr. Martin Luther King, who throughout his life just sacrificed everything that we have so that we can experience what we call true freedom, justice, and equality. And if you think about most of the things that we read and hear about Dr. King, even those of us who did not get the opportunity to see him, we feel like Dr. King is still here. Every time we talk about Dr. King and you listen carefully, you feel and you see that Dr. King is still here with us. And therefore, today is a special day, and I really want to thank Dr. Khalfani and all the organizers bringing us together to have a moment and reflect the good job and the legacy of Dr. King, and also not just to reflect and think about that, or take an action and make sure that we are also going to do something different to reinforce what Dr. King did. Always I say that we have resources, and the first resource that we have is you. The first resource that we have is me. What am I doing? What are you doing to make things better for one another? So Dr. King will really and ever be appreciated if he sees us, if he hears us doing something that is reinforcing the vision that he had for mankind. Let's use everything that we have to support one another and to promote the peace, justice, fairness, everywhere we go. Every job that you have, every position that you have, the first question we must always ask is, what am I doing to show that kind of kindness to mankind and bring peace and promote justice, freedom, and fairness, equality, all the other things that will make this world a better place. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event. I'm in another meeting, but there's no way I could have continued that meeting without stopping by here and salute each one of you for being champions. God bless you. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Boyce, thank you very much. And with that said, we're going to go ahead and get into this talk we have here today. I want to thank all the people who are joining us online. Screen's a little dim, so I can't really see how many people we got. We got about 5, 6, 7 people online right now. So if you want to tell your friends and invite somebody else to join us online, you can share the link that you have. And I won't do a Facebook thing right now because that'll probably take it to do something else that I don't want it to do. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I appreciate all the folks who are making today possible. And this is going to be a powerful opportunity for us to really delve into this discussion and to think about some things differently. All right. So good morning, everybody. As I said, I'm Dr. Khalfani. I'm honored to be here with you today. This is an important opportunity for us to have a discussion about the legacy of King, but also where we stand today. Now, a typical discussion on whether or not we are having what's going on regarding the voting may look a little different than the one we're going to have here today. So hold your seat and let's go for an interesting ride. I think Dr. Watch gave us some important remarks to think about where we're going and to be holistic in our approach to this discussion. And the point that the choir made, wading in the water, is propitious in that it gives us an opportunity to think about why were they wading in the water, right? What was going on? What are the things that they were striving for? We're going to come back to that theme a little bit later on. So today I came with the topic of rolling us back. We're going to try to talk a little bit about what's rolling us back or who's rolling us back. And when we talk about voting rights, what does that actually mean? What is it that happens with voting rights? So I put this picture in here. I'm going to show it again later on. Because this is the type of movement that we see today that is going on, that happened during the George Floyd rallies and protests. And what I want us to think about is that these are the things that brought the Voting Rights Act into being, that brought civil rights legislation into being. That none of these things happen without struggle. None of these things happen without people gathering their agency for change. And so we want to think about that today as we're going through this piece here on voting rights. So on the side here, you see there's a bird, the Sankofa bird. I'm going to explain that bird for you in a moment. But the kind of a thing we want to go through in this retrospective for voting rights, we want to say, what is there to understand about the historic voting rights and the collective decision-making process? Why are we using this Sankofa bird to talk about it? And you've got to look at this whole idea of gradations of liberation. What does rolling us back mean, and where do we go from here? Right? King has a whole book on where do we go from here. And so we have to look at that theme. That theme is going to drive what we're talking about here today, because we want to know where we're going and why we're going there. So the Sankofa bird is a Ghanaian symbol from West Africa, and that bird represents, you see how it looks, it's a bird that is going in one direction but is looking back, right? And so the idea behind it, the meaning is that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And so often we forget to look back, or we don't look back far enough to understand where we're headed. And so I want us to think that just looking back briefly may not be enough looking back. We may need to revisit, to reconsider what it means to look back when we're talking about bringing change into being. So that when we do so, let's look back in the way that the Khan folks do and why they came up with the idea of Sankofa. Sankofa Bird on one level says it's okay to go back and get that what you've forgotten, right? So what did we forget and why are we at this place where there is this rolling back of our voting rights? There's a discussion across the country in various states that are talking about this, that are enacting legislation. How did we get to this point? The Sankofa bird also is, if you look at its mouth, what you see is an egg. And this egg represents both the youth and the history. And so for the egg to hatch, that there has to be someone or some group of folks who are protecting it, right? So the egg, when it's ready, hatches itself. That the mother or whoever's watching it has to nurture it, but they don't break the shell. Once what's inside is ready, it comes out. But if those who are surrounding it are not protecting it, then what happens is that the egg, what's in the egg, could be eaten. So we have to recognize that we have a responsibility to both protect our history, our legacy, and the youth that are coming up. And we can see all three of those things as being represented by the egg. And the egg has to have the proper surroundings so that when a child is born, it's not enough just for the child to be born. That it has to have the parent to nurture that child into adulthood. The child can't even feed itself, can't move around once it's born. It has to have someone to nurse it, or to give it a bottle, to feed it, and to keep it warm and to clean it. So what is it that we have to do with our legacy that is involving us thinking about this way, that our legacy is this egg that we're birthing. We're constantly birthing. There's no one egg, there's many eggs. And if we're birthing those eggs, are we protecting them along the way? Are we doing the things necessary to get it to the next point? So if we're not, then we need to reassess what we're doing. And we need to reassess the area around us of who might be out there attacking the egg and the surroundings of the egg. Who might be attacking our rights, our privileges, our voting rights, our human rights, our civil rights? Who might be attacking them if we're not standing up fighting for them? So we need to think about that we have to be the ones that protect it, because no one's going to do it for us. So where do we start? Voting Rights Act of 1965? Yes and no. Right? There were 5 representatives in the House of Representatives at the time of the Voting Rights Act became law. Right? Then if we think about that, that there were 5 then at that time, but there were many more during the Reconstruction era. What happened? Did somebody not protect the egg? Did the egg become vulnerable? Did our legacy of struggle become vulnerable? Did we not have the things in place? Were there other folks who were the predators of our being that prevented us from being able to thrive in that environment? We moved to surviving. And we're, in some ways, still in survival mode. And we have to think about, is survival mode a place for us to move forward in ways that enables us to have generations do well? And I would suggest to you that maybe not. But there was something important from that. Brother Ray Wimbush wrote a book, and he talks about how 250,000 African Americans got registered to vote by the end of 1965. So that was a powerful movement to get people to the place of being having the right to vote. So there were benefits in it. So we don't suggest that there weren't benefits. Right, that people getting to the place where they felt protected enough to be able to participate in electoral politics, to go out and voice their concerns, but also to engage in the actual voting process. Now here we go. During the Reconstruction Era, which was in the 1860s, that you'll see that we had 16 members of Congress, 2 in the Senate and 14 in the House of Representatives. And here they are, these are their names. Now there were more then than there were when the Voting Rights Act passed. So what does that tell us? That tells us that something happened. That tells us that there was a regression. It tells us that there was a whole movement against our participation. So you had the Ku Klux Klan, you had the federal government and state and municipal governments that were engaged in specific strategies to diminish the vote, to disenfranchise African Americans. And so we have to say that, how could we have prevented that? Could we have? And what were the things that we we may have done differently looking at it today, right? Because if someone is rolling back your rights today, how far can they roll it back? How far are we willing to allow them to be rolled back until we get to the place where we're actually willing to do something to stand up like those folks we saw in the early picture? Do we have to wait for someone to have some kind of egregious step that's going to keep us even more oppressed and suppressed? We can't allow the vote to be suppressed. What are we going to do? If there was this many people who were there before, what do the numbers look like today? So we see that when you look at it, there was, as I said before, there's 5, and then during the Reconstruction era, there was from 1865 to 1877. That's what the numbers were. Today, we have 57 African Americans who sit in the House of Representatives and 2 senators, right? And when Kamala Harris was in the Senate, there was 3. Now, the question becomes, do we have power? And is it about numbers or is it about substance? And so we have to push the envelope to make sure that we bring in the whole idea that we want to have more numbers, and we have to have our agenda items that are advocated for strongly, and that we are willing to move the needle in the process. That we don't want to allow anyone to continue to unravel what we're doing. And so I suggest to you that starting in 1865 might not be enough. So I say, no, starting in 65 limits our scope of understanding about what voting rights are about. Before we ask about voting, we must know, what do we do to achieve without the votes? And through this political participation, that how many different ways can we participate to create change, right? So sometimes we think it's just about elected officials, but it's not just about elected officials, it's about each one of us. Each one of us being engaged in the electoral process, each one of us being engaged in the process, not just about elections, but about politics and policy making. Us being engaged in understanding that we've got to know what's going on in the world around us. We've got to know that it's not just about what's going on in the United States, but we've got to understand the global politics. That's what voting rights would suggest to us, that when they were pushing for voting rights, we have to raise the question about what is it that they were pushing for. One of the things we look at here, in 2020, 19 states passed 34 laws restricting voting access. Restricting voting access in 2021. So in other words, they are rolling back your rights, making it more restrictive, making it more challenging for you to engage in the process. So what do we do? Additionally, 440 bills have been introduced with provisions restricting voting access in nearly all 50 states, 49 of them. So that there's still further efforts that are set to happen if you don't do something. If we don't do something across the country, not just in one state, in all the states. Now, there also are legislations that have passed, some of that have already passed, and some that are on the books, to make it more accessible. Even in some of the states where they're rolling things back, they also do some things constructive. So it keeps us somewhat confused because we don't know which way things are coming, right? If you do something on one side that's beneficial and you do something on another side that's conflicting or challenging, then if I'm not really paying close attention, I may only see one aspect of it. And so we want you to make sure that we're observant, that we are willing to dig into and find out what's going on so that we know all the different sides of what's going on and we can talk about it and think about it in ways that are pushing the envelope, that are progressive. So we ask the question, is democratic rule of basis of government, is that our ideal way of doing it? Or is there something else that we need to think about? Why would there be a movement to restrict, suppress, disenfranchise folks in America? We have to ask those questions. Sometimes the folks who are in politics or academics ask those questions. But when I talk to my students, sometimes I realize that they forget that those laws that are passed affect them in every day. There's so many laws passed on the municipal, the county, the state, and the federal level that if you're not paying attention, that there's things that affect you that you don't know have an effect on you. And there's an old saying that says ignorance of the law is no excuse. So that once it affects you, it's still impacting you in the movement of what you're doing in your family. And so we have to be cognizant of that, because if we're not, then we become victim to it, or potentially become victim to it. So I want us to think about that as we're going through this process. We want to know who or what is the beneficiaries of this outcome. Who benefits from suppressing the vote? I mean, when somebody passes a law, they're passing it for a particular person or a particular purpose, for a particular set of benefits to someone. It may be consequence to someone, but what's the other side of the coin? And sometimes we fail in our analysis to look at both sides of the coin. I want us to be aware of both sides of the coin, because when it's flipped, you can get either side, and either side can impact you. And so who it benefits, or whom it benefits, sometimes we may not know, because there may be some subtle text in there that we're not paying close attention to. And we need to pay more closer attention to the subtle text in the legislation. We need to pay closer attention to not just the things that come on the news, because that's what we oftentimes pay attention to, is just something that's on the news, but there's also laws that you never see because they're not on the news, but also have an impact on you. So the idea of voter suppression is important for us to think about, because voter suppression impacts things like criminal justice reform, right? If we're not engaged in the discussion of when criminal justice reform happens or doesn't happen, where do we sit? Right here in New Jersey, there's a whole discussion about the Civilian Complaint Review Board. How many of us know about it? How many of us know that it's been up there for a while and there's been pushback? There's all kinds of other legislation that we should think about. You know, the new legislation in New Jersey about marijuana, and how that impacts folks who are formerly incarcerated or still incarcerated. People who have license to get to those, to set those businesses up. But is that equitable as well, right? We have to raise the questions about these things, because what happens if we don't adequately address them, there's something called a Heron vote democracy. Heron vote democracy, this came as a term that was developed looking at so-called democracy in South Africa. So in South Africa, you had apartheid, right? I lived in South Africa for a little while in '94 and also in '95. But I was there right after Mandela got elected in '94. And when you think about this idea of what's called the Heron vote democracy, what it means is that democracy only happens for a small segment of the population. So as far as the British and the Afrikaners were concerned in South Africa, they had a democratic state. They got to vote, they got to choose who their elected officials were, they had free movement, they didn't have any of the restrictions that Africans and colored folks and Indians had. So there was all these different levels of governance that happened for different people. But they presented it to the world like there was a democracy there. But there wasn't a democracy. There was extreme segregation, racial segregation, by design, through a system called apartheid. And there's been apartheids in other places around the world and have acted that way. And so how we have to look at why and how those things happen. And to whom are they impacting? And if we're not careful, they might impact you. It might impact someplace you know. It might impact some people whom you know. And restrict your movement. But we have to be mindful of that as we're looking at it. So this Heron vote democracy was a particular type of thing. But it's interesting though, because even in those environments, sometimes people who participate in society benefit from things, but they actually undermine some of the things that they even benefit. I wrote a book in 2005 called The Hidden Debate. We'll talk a little bit about it later on. But in there we talk about, there's this quote here that I'm using, and it's similar. It says, for example, European women or white women were beneficiaries of European privilege, but they suffered numerous inequalities throughout American history, right? That's from Sankofa Bird. Which begs the question, did Europeans or white folks honestly value the principles that they professed, right? Did they value the ideas of liberty, equality, justice? Were those things valued, or was a particular type of thing that they were valuing from those that was on the table? But once again, it was something that was nuanced in such a way that many people didn't understand because it was meant for a certain segment of the population. Can and do you have justice and just and egalitarian society when only a select few in society enjoy justice and equality? Okay. Is that just and equal? Right? So if I tell you that, oh yeah, we have democracy, we have equality, we have freedom, but there's a whole group of folks who don't experience it, who are looking at you like you're crazy because they don't know what you're talking about. Right? Whether they're talking about poverty or they're talking about access to education, is there equality in that sense? I was watching some videos today and yesterday as I was preparing for this lecture and looking at some of the atrocious ways in which African Americans experience their lives, right? Standing on your own yard and the police drive by and suggest that you're doing something criminal. And then they want to harass you in the process. And you ask the question, why? And the answer in some of those things that I saw were that the persons who knew the law they got harassed, but they didn't have any complications from that harassment afterwards, right? But if you don't know the law and you start answering and doing things that actually violate your own law, your rights, then you get exposed to things in ways that can be problematic for you. And so one of the things I saw watching these videos was that the folks who understood their rights were the ones who were able to push back. And I suggest that it's not just with criminal justice reform that we need to be able to push back, but we need to be able to push back in all kinds of ways to make sure that we have a fair and just society, that equality exists for everybody and not just for a handful of folks, not just because you have money or because you have privilege of having white skin or something, that there's these barriers that are created that we haven't fully addressed in American society. We've got to have a polity that enables us to address these things and to move the dialogue to another direction, to help folks we have to heal from the pains and the conflicts and challenges that happened under slavery, right? The enslavement of African peoples, the torture and torment of Native Americans, and all the different immigration challenges that we see. That we gotta have healing from those things before we can actually move forward. We haven't talked too much about healing. So I asked the question about the Heron vote democracy. We spoke about it a little bit, but I just want to also say that Europeans did not uniformly experience it. Actually, no, I've covered this piece already, so we'll move on. As we're talking about this, though, I want us to think about this in a way that a great Judge Leon Higginbotham, he made some great inroads and sacrifices and pushed the envelope in the ways that we need to push the envelope. So in my book, I wrote this thing about gradations of liberation, and he had something similar that he talked about. And so I say that Dr. King was engaged in a fight to build on the works and the struggles for liberation and freedom. He was building on the works of folks who came before him. And we have a great brother in the audience, Don Oliveri, if you can wave your hand. He struggled with Dr. King. He knew Dr. King. He got arrested with Dr. King. And so we're honored to have him here in the room today. Let's give him a round of applause for his work. And so when we think about the works of folks who've been engaged for the struggle for a long time, we have to say that we want to know, when we're talking about voting rights, that what is it that those rights were struggling for? Voting rights cannot be looked at in a vacuum. It often is. Right? That we look at voting and not something outside of that. Especially for African Americans, voting rights are part of a long fight or a push in what I call gradations of liberation, which means that, and Judge Higginbotham calls it that we need to be thinking about shades of freedom, as he talks about. In fact, I'll read this quote and then I'll tell you my analysis. He argues that we must seek institutional changes that move from shades of freedom to further sunlight of justice, freedom, equality. And so, between Judge Higginbotham and my own take on the gradations of liberation, what that means is that as we're striving for freedom, equality, and justice, we only get a little piece of it at the time. And sometimes we think that little piece is the whole thing, or somebody suggests to us that that little piece is the whole thing. But in fact, we haven't arrived yet. We haven't gotten there. And so since we haven't, the question becomes, what happened in the process? What is the thing that these gradations actually mean? And I suggest to you that these gradations of liberation are things that put us to sleep. Because we think sometimes that things have moved and we're okay where we are, but in fact, we need to keep fighting. We need to keep pushing. We need to push the people who we elect in office once they're there to bring about change and to bring about the change of the things that we're interested in. We needed to push a little harder on President Obama. Maybe we need to push a little harder on President Biden. We need to push a little harder on the governor. We need to push a little harder on the mayor. We need to push a little harder on all elected officials so that we can make sure that our voices are heard and not muted. Let us not wait until we have a trauma or a tragedy to actually have our voices heard. Let us continue to work and strive for the changes that need to happen, because otherwise, it's like being on a treadmill or jogging in the woods in the mountain, and you get up to the top of the hill and you're like, oh, I'm done. But then you go down to the valley and you start going down, and it feels good. It's easy going down. But then you realize there's a bigger hill on the other side. And so these gradations of liberation are like that up and down the hill. And we want to have a smooth plateau that we find, right? So that we get to, King talked about, he get to the mountaintop. But he also raised the question as to whether or not he, through integration, he led his people into a burning house. That's for us to determine. And if we say that we smell smoke, then what are we going to do? We smell smoke. Are we going to put out the fire and begin to build something? There's a great brother who is let me be mindful of time. A great brother who is involved in helping us to rethink about how we do this. Brother's name is Baba Wakesa. And one of the things he talks about is that we oftentimes see or saw ourselves as warriors, right? We're fighting against oppression, white supremacy, sexism, economic disenfranchisement, voting disenfranchisement. All these things were excluded or outside of the social structure. But we fought against those things. But one of the things he tells us is that, well, that narrative actually is flawed. Because we can't just be warriors. Warriors are tear things apart. We need to be warriors, healers, and builders, he said. What are we building? building for the legacy for our children who come after us? And not just your own biological children, but the children of the children of the children. You see, that's how we have to think. We've got to think 5, 10 generations down the road. What legacy are we building? A great example is the legacy of those who built the pyramids, those Africans in ancient Kemet, right? Ancient Egypt. They built pyramids that still stand today and are still telling a story. We're still learning from what they told us. We're learning from those Africans who understood technology in a way that we still don't understand it today. Right? You get ink and it smears, it washes away. Well, the San people who did rock art, they understood technology in a way that their writings are still on the walls 30,000 years later. What do we do today that might last 30,000 years? Right? Tell me one ink cartridge that's going to last 30,000 years today. Well, we think technology, we only think computers. We only think these keyboards. No, we had technology already. It's in our blood. But we haven't utilized the technological thought process that's within us. You got to search back into your DNA so that you can pull back on the technology that you already have. If I ask you, what is the greatest wall, the longest wall in the world? Most of you probably say the Great Wall of China, right? Well, actually, there was another group of folks who made a wall longer than that one. The Great Wall of China is 5,500 miles, right? But the Great Wall of Benin is 9,900 miles. 4 times more material than the Great Wall of China. So why don't we know about these things? And why am I talking about it during a lecture on voting rights? Because I want you to understand that the narrative that's out there, you've got to reposition your mind to see and think about the world differently, because somebody else is telling you a narrative about what to look at and where to look and how to bring about change, and it hasn't brought us the change that we want and that we need. It's brought us gradations of liberation. And gradations of liberation is not freedom. We want real freedom. We want true equality. We want a just system. And those things haven't been acquired. So, Justice Higginbotham pushed for those things. But even in the end, he suggested that maybe we didn't get there. Maybe there was something that we missed in the process. And I'm in agreement with what he was talking about. That he said we had shades of freedom, but not freedom. The book I wrote, The Hidden Debate, I have a piece in here I want to read to you about Du Bois, something that Du Bois says. It says, however, Du Bois pointed out that Emancipation Proclamation did not afford them, being Africans, the freedoms they desired. In fact, it not even meant that they would recognize as citizens. Africans were not recognized as citizens in the United States and given full voting rights until the 14th and the 15th Amendment, when they were ratified. So if slavery ended in 1865, there's the answer to your question. Although legal citizenship and voting rights for African people were significant gradations, right? These gradations of liberation I'm talking about. In the struggle for liberation, they did not grant the liberty, the freedom, the justice, nor the general recognition by Europeans of African citizenship without cajoling and coercion, the invocation of moral imperative by the abolitionists, and the threat of forced arms. That's what Rubio said. That Europeans had to be coerced and forced by police, military, and or legislation demonstrates 2 things, I say. 1, their unwillingness to relinquish the privileges and preferences that they enjoyed under the colonial and slave rule. Right? So that the things that they benefited from, they didn't want everybody to experience. 2, that they valued principles like liberty, equality, and justice, but instead of in a humanistic manner, they did so in a Heron vote manner. like I said before, here we go, that they valued it for themselves. And so that's why you have, not just in the United States, but around the world, you had to be someone who could participate in the electoral process. In South Africa, you had to be a Burgher. And what that meant was that, like here, you had to be white, European, you had to have money, and those were the things that would require for you to be able to participate, right? A freeholder, what was a freeholder in New Jersey? They just changed that about a year and a half ago. So a freeholder meant that you had to be a freeholder of land. It's the same as a burgher. And so when we think about those things, what are the implications of that for everybody else, even within the language that just recently got removed? That those things have relics that they bring forth. And I'm going to suggest to you, when we're thinking about the idea of the struggle for voting rights, is that part of the struggle is ill-placed. That voting rights, I argue in the hidden debate, that we focus oftentimes on the surface and we don't get to the core of the problem. So the voting rights are important, but they're a part of the surface debate. The real debate is at the core, and that is that do we all have the same idea and interpretation about liberty, equality, and justice? Does everyone see it that those things are universal? And oftentimes they're presented to us as universals, but when you look at how they participate in society, they're not treated as universals. So if they're not treated as universal, they're not universal. And we've got to be the ones who push the envelope to make sure that these non-universal concepts include our interpretation of them. We have to define for ourselves what liberty, equality, and justice is. Can't have somebody else's definition of what it is, because then you're not included in the process. And we keep thinking we're included in the process because we have and hear the words, because someone says something to you, but then the reality of your participation is another experience. How do we move the needle? How do we change the participation in it so that we are then the ones who are engaged in it? And part of that is that we have to be engaged in both electoral politics, but in the structuring of society, not just the electoral politics. We have to be involved in determining the rules of the game, not just being part and parcel of the pawns that are in the game, or being the rook. If you're not seeing and controlling the whole chess table, then you're actually still being guided by somebody else's rules. Maybe we need to play Mancala instead of chess. Mancala's an African game. So we can think about these things and push the envelope on what voting rights means. See, the typical narrative that we come to these kind of discussions and have is just that, well, what was voting, how many people got to vote in 1965, what was it like before that, and what is it now? No, we need to move the envelope to talk about something other than just voting rights, because just voting has not had the type of change that we're looking for. Not that we don't need to do it, but we need to look at it in a different way. As we'll see, at each stage of liberty was expected to be achieved, a new type of oppression emerged, or more accurately, was upon those who were striving for liberty, equality, and justice. Each layer of oppression or tool of the oppressor that was removed ushered in a new gradation of liberation, where we're or not Africans in South Africa reaching final freedom. So the question is that, what was it the freedom that they were seeking, and did they get it? And South Africa is a good example here, right? One of the things I talk about in the book is that in South Africa, they had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? We just heard a lot about it because Desmond Tutu passed. But even Desmond Tutu later on, now, during the memorial, people didn't talk about that. But he decried, he said it was a failure. But nobody's talking about that during his memorial. They just talked about it as an entity. No, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not bring to bear the justice that he was talking about. It didn't happen. It's like King asking, all this pushing I've been doing for integration, did it bring my people into a burning house? In South Africa today, what do we see? We see that that in some ways the house is burning, because there's this constant conflict. There's this dialogue about these things. And until we begin to push the envelope on that, we see that what's going on is that the masses are still uprising in South Africa. Why? Because they don't have access to the land. They don't have the resources that they're looking for. They're still impoverished. Europeans still own the majority of the land in South Africa. So all of these are important things that we have to talk about and see that people are concerned about. And until we begin to look at it that way, we don't understand really what's going on. When do we get to final freedom? I'm going to play a little clip for you by Stacey Abrams. What role did Dr. King play in the fight for civil rights? So we're going to play a quick clip for you by King, and we're going to play another one about suppression by Stacey Abrams. So let's hope this plays.
Understand that voting is directly tied to the services and policies that you want to see. Voter suppression acts as a means of denying those policies reality, and it is baked into the DNA of America. It has been perfected in recent years, in the last 2 decades, in a way that lets us forget that it's real because it has so many pieces, and that's the architecture. Voter suppression isn't simply saying you can't vote. Voter suppression is both a physical activity, but it's also a psychic effect. Telling people their votes won't count, telling people that the system is rigged, has the act of actually stopping people from trying to use it. And then just to make sure it works, there is the actual apparatus. And I think about it in 3 ways. There is the registration access, making it difficult to get on the rolls. You cannot vote in the United States unless you are signed up to do so, so you have to driver's license. And so what we have found is that depending on the state you're in, there have been impediments put in place to registration. If you're in Texas, they tell third-party organizations it's difficult to register. That matters because the hardest to register communities are communities of color, newly registered citizens, and low-income communities. They require third parties to come to them because they often don't know how to do it on their own. In Georgia, we had sort of a trifecta of, it was hard to get on the rolls because the Secretary of State kept raiding the offices or attacking those who were doing third-party registrations. He then used what's called exact match, which said that if your name has any error when someone is typing it into the system, that would be a predicate for denying you the right to vote. And in Georgia in 2018, 53,000 people were caught up in this bureaucratic nightmare. So let's say your last name is Del Rios, and you spell it D-E-L space R-I-O-S, so that's your last name. Under Georgia law, or not Georgia law, but Georgia's practice on your driver's license, they take out the space. So that becomes the database that is used. But your parents named you Del Rios with a space. You put in your name the way it is on your birth certificate and on your Social Security card. But in Georgia, because the Driver's License Administration does not recognize the space, you are denied the right to vote because it does not exactly match the database. 53,000 people were denied. 90% of them were people of color. The third part is that if you were a naturalized citizen, there were some parts of the Secretary of State's office that were demanding that you use your alien registration number as part of your application. It is against the federal law to use your alien registration number because you're no longer an alien. You are now a citizen. And so in order to achieve the right to vote, you were being denied access. So registration is the first. And then there's the use it or lose it laws. That's the Ohio case that was settled by the Supreme Court. In the United States, we do not have mandatory voting. Use it or lose it laws were originally designed to say that if you're dead or you move, you probably shouldn't vote where you used to live. That makes sense. But it's now been used to say if you don't vote in a certain number of successive elections, that can be used as a reason to take you off the rolls. But the problem is it's not precise. You see hundreds of thousands of people who are removed from the rolls who voted. And they don't find out they've been removed until they go to vote. But because most of these states don't do same-day registration, you're just denied the right to vote. So that's the first piece, registration. Second is ballot access. Ballot access is you, in states that have absentee balloting, you apply for an absentee ballot. It may or may not arrive. Jermaine Dupree, who's so deaf, he had to fly his daughter from Miami because her absentee ballot, which she applied for, never showed up. Jermaine Dupree ain't my dad. So If you do not have someone who is wealthy enough to actually fly you home to vote, you've been suppressed because your right to vote has been denied because you didn't get access to ballot. If you live in Mississippi or Alabama, you may have to pay a notary public to verify that you have submitted your ballot properly, which means you have to pay someone for the right to vote. So ballot access becomes an issue. It also is an issue with early voting, losing polling places. Georgia has about 3,000 polling places, precincts. They shut down 214 of them. If you live in a county where there are only 2, and now there's 1 and you don't have a car, and the one that you used to go to is down the street, and the one you have to go to now is 5 to 10 miles away, you're not going to be able to vote because you don't have a car.
So they give you some insight about some of the things going on, what voter suppression looks like, right? We need to be clear that those things are happening and that there's, what she mentioned is just a few of the incidences. And so we have to wonder, how do we address those things? How do we confront them? And what is the legacy of those that confronted those things in the past? Well, here's King now. King had some similar issues he was addressing back in 1966.
Our representative today, I come to ask you to go all out to get every Negro in this county registered to vote. Each of you assembled here today decided that you were going to see that 10 other people are registered before the last day, which I think is next weekend, the 14th, I believe. Just see what a power you can be. Then after getting people registered, that is another even greater responsibility. And that is to go out to vote in the primary. The state of South Carolina, during the days of Reconstruction, sent many Negroes to the state legislature. The state of South Carolina not only sent them to the state legislature, Negroes to the Congress of the United States. The last Negro to leave the Congress of the United States was from the state of South Carolina. And in his farewell address, the one thing that he said that even though this is a period that ends for us for a while, we will come again. Right here from this county and all over the state of South Carolina, once more we would be able to send to the State House. Once more we have the opportunity to send to the Congress of the United States competent, qualified, dedicated black men and women. Let us on that glad day in June march on ballot boxes. But this is the way we are going to straighten up the South and the nation. Let us march on ballot boxes. So somehow we will be able to develop that day. Men will have food and material necessities for their bodies, freedom and dignity for their spirit, education and culture for their minds. Let us march on ballot boxes. The men and women will no longer walk the streets in search for jobs that do not exist. Let us march on ballot boxes until the empty stomachs of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina are filled. Let us march on ballot boxes.
So I'm going to stop there because we still got the choir to come back up. But I want to just to use this as a place for us to think about that here King is saying, right, let us march on ballot boxes. He's saying that we not only do we need people to register, we need you to get out and go vote, right? Registering doesn't mean anything if you don't participate. And he's saying that he wants you to wake up to think, to see that there's power. And when there's regression, what he was talking about, when there's pushback, that let us see it as only temporary, and that we have the power to bring about change. So if there is a pushback there's this pushback for the suppression of the vote, and these things are happening, it doesn't mean that it has to maintain that way, and that we have the power to push back in another way to bring another thing into reality. So let us be mindful of that and make sure that we're not stuck on the fact that this, and get so depressed that suppression is happening. I have a thing here I want to show you in Georgia, but I don't know if we'll get to all of it. That in Georgia, it's illegal for you to give somebody in the line a bottle of water or something to eat. Think about that. That you be charged a misdemeanor for giving somebody a bottle of water while they're in line. And they created, as Stacey Abrams already said, they created the conditions for the lines to be long. The lines didn't have to be long. They got rid of some of the polling places and closed them, and so now that's why the lines are long. See, we think that the lines are long, it's just because a lot of people voted. There are, but there's also other measures that are preventing people from having access to it. So how do we address that? We've got to be holistic in our approach. We can't be linear in our thinking and doing. We've got to think outside the box and do outside the box. Looking back further, and I have a bunch more, but I'm going to wrap this up. That when we think about Dr. King rolling the fight for voting rights and accomplishments and the works of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, that you have the whole idea of voter suppression is a long history of civil rights, which is basically looking at things domestically, and human rights, which are looking at things beyond that internationally, that we have to look back and say, what is it that is voting the key? And I want us to take a look, we take a step way back and we say, well, this fight had actually occurred before, right? That Paul Robeson and others, that they were engaged in 1951. They took to the UN this whole thing. They had a signed petition that's talking about, we charge genocide. And what was their point? The point was that looking at not just voting, but the precursors of it, the thing I said is underneath it, the ideas of liberty, equality, and justice. And so that's the thing that we want to focus on, that voting is a tool to get to liberty, equality, and justice, but not the only tool. Right? So we have to think about voting rights as a tool in the fight for liberty, equality, and justice. What are the other tools that we can employ to make sure that those things happen? How do we get there? We learned from Malcolm. We learned from Paul Robeson, from William Patterson. Him and Robeson worked together, and they took these documents, one in Paris, one in the United States, because for them, they were internationalizing. Malcolm wanted to do the same thing. He said, we got to take our argument not just to the United States government, but to the United Nations. These are recurring things. These are things that have happened before them. So that the struggles for liberty, equality, and justice are things that have been going on for many, many, many decades, centuries. And so that the push against enslavement was another front on the same thing. These are all kinds of things we can think about. This is the Georgia example. Some of the things that happen in Georgia, voters have fewer days to request an absentee ballot. There are stricter ID requirements. Voters, it's illegal for elected officials to hand out absentee ballots, to mail them out to everybody, so that you can't just have, like we here in New Jersey, where if you ask for it, they just send it out. You can't do that there, right? Mobile voting centers are banned. They restricted some of the ballot boxes. Early voting is expanded, so they have one thing that they did in smaller counties, but the question is, did that also impact the urban areas? We don't know that. I have to look more deeply at it. Of course, I already talked about the water and things. But I want you to think that the idea for us about voting rights, and when we look at it as a retrospective, it's not just about voting rights, it's about equality, it's about justice, it's about freedom. How do we get there? And we've got to raise the dialogue and begin to start pushing the envelope for how we get there. We're going to get there because we're going to keep fighting. We're going to wake up students. We're going to wake up folks to realize that we have the power to do these things, and that we have the resources. We have the intellect. We have all these scholars who've written all these books already. We need to go read the books that the scholars have already written. We don't need any new studies. They've already been done. There's hundreds of them. And go read Mary Frances Berry. Go read stuff by Higginbotham. go read all these different books that are out there that help us to understand what happened and what's happening, and then use that as a place to engage in change. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. I hope that we covered something that was useful and insightful to you. I want to thank again my brother Jamil for helping to make this happen. And let's make sure we continue the legacy of Dr. King by pushing the envelope, and also those folks, it wasn't just Dr. King, but all those folks who struggled with him and all the other people engaged, that they collectively are the ones that brought about the change. And we have to realize that collectively we can do the same today. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite the choir back up and have 2 more selections for us. So let's welcome the choir back to the stage, please.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Khalfani, for that absolutely wonderful lecture on voting. And it was just phenomenal. It was excellent. Give him another hand. My name is Dr. Dexter Auld, and I'm professor of music here at Essex County College. We're just pleased to be with you. And with the voting rights throughout history, the music has always been a part of the struggle for African Americans. And that's why we selected music this morning to reflect that, and of course of Dr. Martin Luther King. So we're going to come forth with our singers here this morning. Just wanted to let you know who our singers are. Adrian Matthews, right here, chorus. Stafford, Marilyn Williams, Marina Thomas, and our flautist was Tatiana Hall Act. So we're coming with 2 selections. Sooner we'll be done on The Trouble of the World, and then we're going to do a medley, Glory and We Shall Overcome.
Trouble of the world.
Heron, and I'll talk in front of the camera. We want to thank you all for coming, and we hope that you all enjoyed the program. We're going to have more programs to come. I want to just, before the choir leaves and the professor leaves and Jamil, I want us to get a picture up here so we can do that real quick, a couple of pictures. And just really thank you all for coming. There's a bunch of folks online. We got over 20 folks, 25 folks online. So we're glad that you all were able to join us online. Thank you. Feel free. We're going to post this up so you can share it to other folks. We hope that it was powerful for you. And thanks for coming. And we'll see you next time around. Let the struggle continue.